Yeah, please start.
Although I have suppressed a large number of quite interesting details, this case history of Anna O has grown bulkier than would seem to be required for a hysterical illness that was not in itself of an unusual character. It was, however, impossible to describe the case without entering into details, and its features seem to me of sufficient importance to excuse this extensive report. In just the same way, the eggs of the echinoderm are important in embryology, not because sea urchin is a particularly interesting animal, but because the protoplasm of its eggs is transparent, and because what we observe in them thus throws light on the probable course of events in eggs whose protoplasm is opaque. The interest of the present case seems to me, above all, to reside in the extreme clarity and intelligibility of his pathogenesis.
Right. So he talks about here why he has documented this case of NAO. Because here, usually what is unconscious and difficult to excavate is all out there in the open. And that is what people say is the difference between neurosis and psychosis. That in psychosis, the unconscious is completely out there in the open. And in neurosis, it undergoes vicissitudes and comes out in a disguised coded form. Jung made a very good statement on this. He said, the psychotic is a man who is dreaming in the world full awake. That we all dream in the sleep, but a psychotic is dreaming with his eyes open. So this is how Freud justifies the importance of NAO. Let us go ahead.
Yeah, there were two psychical. Can you hear me?
Yeah, please go on.
There were two psychical characteristics present in the girl while she was still completely healthy, which acted as predisposing causes for her subsequent hysterical illness. Her her monotonous family life and the absence of adequate intellectual occupation left her with an unemployed surplus of mental liveliness and energy, and this found an outlet in the constant activity of her imagination. 2. This led to a habit of daydreaming, her private theater, which laid the foundations for a dissociation of her mental personality. Nevertheless, a dissociation of this degree is still within the bounds of normality. Reveries and reflections during a more or less mechanical occupation do not in themselves imply a pathological splitting of consciousness, since if they are interrupted, if, for instance, the subject is spoken to, the normal unity of consciousness is restored, nor, presumably, is any amnesia present. In the case of Anna O, however, this habit prepared the ground upon which the affect of anxiety and dread was able to establish itself in the way I have described. When once that affect had transformed the patient's habitual daydreaming into a hallucinatory absence. It is remarkable how completely the earliest manifestations of her illness in its beginnings already exhibited its main characteristics, which afterwards remained unchanged for almost 2 years. These comprise the existence of a second state of consciousness, which first emerged as a temporary absence and later became organized into a double conscience, an inhibition of speech, determined by the affect of anxiety, which found a chance discharge in the English verses. Later on, paraphasia and loss of her mother tongue, which was replaced by excellent English. And lastly, the accidental paralysis of her right arm, due to pressure, which later developed into a contractual paresis and anesthesia on her right side. The mechanism by which this latter affection came into being agreed entirely with Charcot's theory of traumatic hysteria, a slight trauma occurring during a state of hypnosis.
So many points here. One is we
Yeah.
can start with the last, a slight trauma occurring during a state of hypnosis. And this can be what Madhusudan had just said. Can you fantasize a trauma? So this can be one of the fantasized traumas occurring in a state of hypnosis. And then we'll also have to differentiate between a real trauma, a fantasized trauma, and a reported trauma. Because there can be a reported trauma which has never been real. It may just be to seek attention and sympathy. And of course, it's very difficult to know because when somebody reports a trauma, to dismiss it, it's something very big in therapy. Right? Anybody will think 10 times before dismissing something as a fantasy trauma. But can it happen in case of dependent personality and in case of histrionic personality, or in some cases of even narcissistic personality? Often you can have a reported trauma which actually has never happened. And I have encountered this more in case of histrionic personalities. And the type of trauma that was narrated uh, were both. Most of them had a sexual content, and some of them had the persecutory content. And I never knew it till a neutral informant, who, of course, knew about the patient everything and about me also. I had a chance occasion to meet that person, and in the presence of the patient, that informant gave some information where the patient could not refute. And that changed completely the story that was presented to me. So that is one of our limitations, that we trust in the patient, that the story the patient is telling us, we don't go out and verify with a third person. And that also is a limitation. In one way, it provides safety, it provides trust, but it also is a limitation. That in
So,
many cases,
so can I ask a question here?
is
So, we are stuck because we have to have faith with the patient, otherwise the patient will not feel safe. Now, does that kind of pre-program us to overvalue the possibility of a trauma even in small things or small reports?
correct. That is definitely a part, that we uh, over invest in what the patient says. That is one. And we see this, the difference we see very clearly when we look at individual therapy and we look at family therapy. Because in family therapy or marital counseling, when you have two or three people in front of you and they talk about each other, so it gives a very different idea. For example, let us say I get a patient of depression who has come to me because of many reasons, one of which is marital discord. And I have sessions going on for 2 3 months. And then something happens, and that patient says, I want you to meet my husband. Now, in strict psychoanalytic psychotherapy, we would not do it, right? We would never meet anybody else except the patient and only in the therapy room. That would be our guideline. But given the practical Indian situation, we are not able to practice many times the Puritan form, the quintessential psychoanalysis. So we actually practice an edited form of it. And when we are doing it, let us say, ask her husband to come and meet me. And when the husband comes and tells the story, it's a very different story. And we see large omissions, large modifications, large insertions, large made up things. And similarly, we can have a dependent personality person, right, who is eager for attention, empathy, and sympathy. And therefore, they may be weaving stories. And there is a movie that someday we will do a movie analysis of, called Spellbound. It's a it's a must see movie for any psychoanalytic course, directed by Alfred Hitchcock. Alfred Hitchcock was very fond of psychoanalysis, like Woody Allen. These two people are in Hollywood. These two people are very fond of psychoanalysis. Were very fond. Let me say, one was were and one is are. Uh, in that movie, in the first scene of the movie, there is a scene of a therapy. And the patient asks the therapist, "Do you think I am lying?" And the therapist says, "The usual proportion." The usual proportion. So this is something that we always have to live with. Some of my teachers used to tell me, always have a healthy suspicion on what is being reported. If one can develop it, it's good. But for adults, it is difficult to really pursue it further. In teenage patients, it's very easy. Right? You can easily make out the believable and the unbelievable. But adults, when they concoct a story, especially if they're well educated, the concoction is very good and it's very difficult to make out. And we don't want to bring the third in therapy. So we trust the person. And that becomes a limitation also. So one part that he says is her monotonous family life and absence of intellectual occupation left her predisposed with lot of energy and not knowing what to do. And this starts what is called the hydraulic model, as though there is some sort of mental energy or libido that has to be invested, and it's almost like a hydraulic model. Just as a fluid is flowing in a hydraulic system, the energy is flowing in the human system. And Freud always talks in those terms, cathexis and catharsis. Cathexis is investment of life energy, libido. Catharsis is release of it. So there is something which is generated. That which is generated is invested. If wrongly invested creates pathology, it has to be then released. Right? So you have affect generation, affect investment, and affect release. So this is essentially a beginning of what is later to be called hydraulic model in psychoanalysis. And if you look at Klein and if you look at Lacan, these are not so hydraulically driven. These are largely non-hydraulic models. If you look at Bion, it's a partly hydraulic model. If you look at ISTDP, it's a completely hydraulic model, 100% hydraulic. The second point here comes up is of private theater. And this concept leads to a second concept of private language. Private theater we all have. We all have a movie director inside of us. We all have movies going on in our minds all the time. In fact, one of the axioms of psychoanalysis is that the human mind always operates either in reality or in fantasy. There is no human mind which can operate only in one. And in fact, Klein puts up a question, what is more primary? Do we think between dreaming or do we dream between thinking? And Klein gives the answer that we think between dreaming. Dreaming is more primal and thinking is a later addition. And one of the analogies to understand it can be that if you look a child how he learns to walk, initially he gets up, tries to walk and falls down. He stumbles. And after a few stumbling, he learns how to walk properly. So that stumbling is what is fantasy. And what we call sane thought, rational thought, objective thought is actually walking. And after a lot of stumbling, we actually walk. After a lot of fantasizing, we actually learn sane thinking. Right? But that sane thinking does not replace the matrix from which it has emerged. So whenever the same thinking stops, we again go back to that matrix of fantasy. And it is effortful, at times even painful, to maintain sane thought. But it's very pleasurable and convenient to regress into fantasy. So if you ask anybody to work, work means essentially that painful, sane, purposeful, result-oriented thinking. And if you don't do that and you are dreaming, you are in a state of reverie, it's very enjoyable. So there is a old saying, children walk to school and they run back home. The same thing we do as adults, we walk to the workplace and we run back home. And therefore they say, thank God it's Friday. It's the same thing. The pain of thought is too much to bear. The stress of thought is too much to bear. Yeah. Hello?
Hello.
Yeah, yeah.
Should I continue? Is somebody saying something?
Hey, Dr.
Yes,
Parvati
sir.
is saying something.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Asking clarification. I did not get that word. They said, thank God it is.
Friday.
Oh, oh.
The week is over. The work is over. Now you have 2 days of reverie, 2 days of fantasy. The reality part is over. Right?
Yes, sir.
So
Who is reading?
let us go to
Where
the
are we, sir?
page 41.
Ah, okay. But whereas the paralysis experimentally provoked by Charcot and his patients became stabilized immediately, and whereas the paralysis caused in sufferers from traumatic neurosis by a severe traumatic shock sets in at once, the nervous system of this girl put up a successful resistance for 4 months. Her contracture, as well as the other disturbances which accompanied it, set in only during the short absences in her condition's second day, and left her during her normal state in full control of her body and possession of her senses, so that nothing was noticed either by herself or by those around her, though it is true that the attention of the latter was centered upon the patient's sick father and was consequently diverted from her.
So he talks about comparing NAO's symptom setting in with generally symptom setting in. In today's language, we will call it conversion disorder setting in. That how does conversion disorder set in different sets of patients? And Freud says in most patients it is at once. Right? But in case of NAO, that conversion disorder in its many manifestations, as well as the somatizations which are happening, they set in over a long period of 4 months.
Since, however, her absences with their total amnesia and accompanying hysterical phenomena grew more and more frequent from the time of her first hallucinatory auto-hypnosis, the opportunities multiplied for the formation of new symptoms of the same kind, and those that had already been formed became more strongly entrenched by frequent repetition. In addition to this, it gradually came about that any sudden distressing affect would have the same result as an absence, though indeed it is possible that such affects actually caused a temporary absence in every case. Chance coincidences set up pathological associations and sensory or motor disturbances, which thenceforward appeared along with the affect. But hitherto, this only occurred for fleeting moments. Before the patient took permanently to her bed, she had already developed the whole assemblage of hysterical phenomena without anyone knowing it. It was only after the patient had broken down completely, owing to exhaustion brought about by lack of nourishment, insomnia, and constant anxiety, and only after she had begun to pass more time in her conditioned second day than, than in her normal state, that the hysterical phenomena extended to the latter as well and changed from intermittent acute symptoms into chronic ones.
Right? So this is very common that before the chronic condition sets in, there is a kind of a trailer of it. So you can see the chronic condition setting in two ways. One, it just sets in and never goes. And second is there is a trailer after which there is an interval and then the chronic thing begins and then never goes. So both situations we see. Now what he says here is any sudden distressing effect would have the same result as an absence, which means the absence is used as a defense against difficult affect, which is also the case in case of derealization and depersonalization. Right? That the abdication of oneself by a self-generated self-doubt in case of depersonalization and a doubt on reality in case of derealization, both of them are defenses against unbearable affect. It is not cognitive in nature because once the episode is over, everything is normal. It is not that a person suffering from depersonalization lives in that state 24/7, 365. And when he is living normally, the entire apparatus is okay. There is no damage to the apparatus per se. But the apparatus goes into a particular mode during the episode, and that we believe is as a defense against the affect. Affect generated inside of the person in depersonalization. And in derealization, affect which is generated because of messages coming from outside. Right? And unless I negate the whole of outside, the messages keep coming in, they keep getting interpreted, and the interpretation keeps producing effects, which I don't want. So I negate the reality of the entire outside. Yeah.
Isn't there a difference that in depersonalization or derealization there is some kind of insight that is preserved?
Inside that is, sorry, uh, can you repeat? I can't hear it.
Depersonalization, whereas in conversion and dissociation, the patient is not aware
Huh. So that
that
will,
is dissociation.
yeah, that will be like this absence.
Yeah.
That will one form of it will be absence, and many people it will say ki, it is happening, it's not me.
Yes, sir.
So the idea there is that what is being denied is owing to some generation of difficult affect. Now the difficult affect may have its roots in intrapsychic processes, in which case I will deny my existence or start doubting my existence. Or it is affect is generated because of something coming from outside, in which case I have to deny the outside or doubt the outside. Now let us say that also does not work, then what will happen? Then the worst movement will be to cognitive thought disorder. Instead of having those derealization experiences occasionally in a micro protoform, if there's something outside which is creating difficult affect inside and I have to stop that coming in, then there are two ways. One is I start doubting the outside and therefore gives me relief. I discount the outside as non-existing, right? Or I start doubting it in some way, or I just stop the thought process which allows me to understand the outside. So then it will be a cognitive thought disturbance where the attack is on the linking of thoughts. Right? Because thoughts are bringing me messages from the outside which are unbearable because of the emotions they are generating inside. So I have to attack the postman who is bringing those messages. Because I can't change those messages and I can't bear the interpretation of those messages. So in between is the postman, and that I have to attack by attacking the linking mechanism of the thought. So it can be essentially what Bion says envy, or as I said, narcissistic rage. We go to page 42.
Question now arises how far the patient's statements are to be trusted and whether the occasions and mode of origin of the phenomena were really as she represented them. So far as the more important and fundamental events are concerned, the trustworthiness of her account seems to me to be beyond question. As regards the symptoms disappearing after being talked away, I cannot use this as evidence. It may very well be explained by suggestion, but I always found the patient entirely truthful and trustworthy. The things she told me were intimately bound up with what was most sacred to her. Whatever could be checked by other people was fully confirmed. Even the most highly gifted girl would be incapable of concocting a tissue of data with such a degree of internal consistency as was exhibited in the history of this case. It cannot be disputed, however, that precisely her consistency may have led her, in perfectly good faith, to assign to some of her symptoms a precipitating cause which they did not, in fact, possess. But this suspicion, too, I consider unjustified. The very insignificance of so many of those causes, the irrational character of so many of the connections involved, argue in favor of their reality. The patient could not understand how it was that dance music made her cough. Such a construction is too meaningless to have been deliberate. It seemed very likely to me, incidentally, that each of her twinges of conscience brought on one of her regular spasms of the glottis, and that the motor impulses which she felt, for she was very fond of dancing, transformed a spasm into a tussis nervosa. Accordingly, in my view, the patient's statements are entirely trustworthy and correspond to the facts.
So this is what we were talking has again come up. How far can you trust the patient, right? And let me give two examples to hone the point further. When the difficulty arises, usually we can trust the patient and it goes on fine. But where does the difficulty arise? One has to be careful in histrionic personality disorder, right, and in dependent personality disorder when it comes to attention seeking and sympathy seeking. Second, one has to be careful when one is dealing with uh, fragile narcissism, where the family members have prevailed upon the patient to come to therapy. Because in many cases, the patient does not want to come, he is prevailed upon by others. Either the psychiatrist recommends or family members recommend because they are at the suffering end. Now, in such cases, I have had many patients who try to uh, manipulate you by mentioning that they are completely okay now because they never wanted to come to therapy in the first place. So within 2-3 sessions or a few sessions, they will say, I'm completely okay and you are really brilliant. So one has to be aware of it. And one of the best ways to deal with it is to say uh, the decision to announce the completion of therapy will depend on three things. One is how you feel. Second, I will administer a psychological test and the scoring will tell us. And third, people around you, what do they say about it? Now, when this triangle is brought in, it's very difficult to fool you. That is number one. Number two is there are certain techniques in ISTDP where if you ask the person to feel his affect related to any particular event or person, there are certain ways in which anxiety moves and the body moves. And nobody can fake those body movements. Okay? So that's a second kind of confirmatory thing that we can look into. That if the patient says, I don't have any feelings towards X, but the body gives a different signal, then it gives us some more idea about it. That is fragile narcissism. We also have to be careful on another group of patients, which are sociopaths. Uh, Psychopath, of course, not much can be done. Nobody has really found a reliable method to really go into psychopathy with some degree of reliability. But sociopathy is something that we can still attempt. And I am working with one, in fact, at present with one. And his technique is different. His technique is to not only, uh, he was with many other therapists before. So what he would do is he would tell them, okay, I am now improving very much. And the therapist would feel he is brilliant. That how come he is getting such a good result in such so fewer sessions? So the therapist would go into a narcissistic high and nothing would move inside of him. So when he came to me, I was told this by his parents that this is how it is. That this man has gone to many therapists and he fools them and nothing happens in terms of his problems. So when he started with me, he figured out in a session or two that he can't take that, try that trick on me. So he tried something more elaborate. He actually started behaving as though he has transformed at his home. So obviously his parents would report to me, it's only 2 sessions and he has transformed. You are really out of this world. So I told them I won't trust anything unless it endures for 6 months. I know I am not that brilliant. Right? That does not mean I am not narcissistic. I am very narcissistic and I believe I am brilliant, but I know that and I am not that brilliant. Right? So let us go this way. Unless anything endures for 6 months, right, I will take it as something temporary.
Flight into health.
Sorry?
Flight into health.
Sorry?
It was called as flight into health
Ha! Flight into health
to avoid analysis.
to avoid analysis. So this sociopathic person uses two tricks. One, he proves to the analyst that you are brilliant. In a couple of sessions, look at how I have improved. Right? And then after some sessions, he will say, I'm cured, I don't need it anymore. Right? Or he will actually act out as though he's transformed at home. Right? So this is what he did. And in therapy, what he will do is he will put out all the eventful uh, parts of his life in front of you for analysis and never allow you to go to the deep core inside. So, by luck, not by ability, but by luck, it happened that I never focused on what he was putting up in the front. It was not my capability or any knowledge, it just happened by luck that I was not focusing on what he was putting up, and he would put up so many eventful things in the front. And I was focusing on deep below, which were causing these things, not these things into themselves. And after some time, I realized that this is a tactic to keep people preoccupied with the front put up and never let them deep inside. So when I pointed this out, that the deep inside is being protected by an over eventful outside, right? Because you give enough fodder for the therapist to keep chewing on, that he never notices the core, which is the real trouble. And when that interpretation was made, right, he realized that the tricks are not working. And then he started avoiding sessions. So now, when he comes back, it will be real work if he comes back. And this is true of fragile narcissistic patients also. page 43.
And now we must consider how far it is justifiable to suppose that hysteria is produced in an analogous way in other patients and that the process is similar where no such clearly distinct condition second A has become organized. I may advance in support of this view the fact that in the present case, too, the story of the development of the illness would have remained completely unknown alike to the patient and the physician if it had not been for her peculiarity of remembering things in hypnosis, as I have described, and of relating what she remembered. While she was in her waking state, she knew nothing of all this. Thus, it is impossible to arrive at what is happening in other cases from an examination of the patients while in a waking state, for with the best will in the world, they can give they can give one no information. And I have already pointed out how little those surrounding the present patient were able to observe of what was going on. Accordingly, it would only be possible to discover the state of affairs in other patients by means of some such procedure as was provided in the case of Anna O by her autohypnosis. Provisionally, we can only express the view that trains of events similar to those here described occur more commonly than our ignorance of the pathogenic mechanism concern has led us to suppose.
Right. So the point here is, when does the unconscious leak out? Right? Because if the unconscious would not leak out, we would not be able to know much about it except through some story of the symptoms. But as we know, unconscious leaks out in 5 ways: in hypnosis, in free association, in dreams, in slips, and in art. In these 5 ways, unconscious mind leaks out. Yeah, please.
In joke
Yeah,
where the superego is fooled and the id comes out.
yeah. So that he covers under the slips.
Yes.
Right. There is a full paper of Freud, psychopathology of everyday life.
And
So uh, what he says here is, okay, because of that unconscious leaking out in the hypnotic state, auto-hypnotic state, we were able to know the unconscious and work with it. And later on, he found that same kind of leakage can happen in free association, right, which is the classical method of psychoanalysis. That we create the situation of the couch and everything so that the unconscious leaks out as far as it is possible. And second, we make use of dream analysis because unconscious leaks voraciously in the dreams. And one can always say there is a part of unconscious which uh, does not leak out, right? What Lacan would call the real. Like one of the Lacanians, Zizek, he makes a very interesting observation on the definition of real. He says, real is that uh, which refuses definition by definition. That it is a area of the unconscious which we don't know anything about. And the moment we know something about it, that part does not remain anymore a part of it. That kind of thing. But Freud is still in the very preliminary stages of the unconscious. So there is no segregation of unconscious into further segments. The unconscious is just one consolidated whole. We are not looking at that part of the unconscious which goes into dreams, that part of the unconscious which is half processed, that part of the unconscious which will never come up. We are still looking at full unconscious as though everything there can potentially come up. Right? And there is no difference in the degree of processing which is there inside. We are not in the Bionian way that something is half processed, something is 75% processed. Right? So we are not into that sophistication, further classification of the unconscious. We are still looking it as one consolidated whole of a container of difficult things. Yeah. When the when the patient had become
When the patient had become confined to her bed and her consciousness was constantly oscillating between the normal and a secondary state, the whole host of hysterical symptoms which had arisen separately and had hitherto been latent became manifest, as we have already seen, as chronic symptoms. There was now added to these a new group of phenomena which seemed to have had a different origin. The paralytic contractures of her left extremities and the paresis of the muscles raising her head. I distinguished them from the other phenomena because when once they had disappeared, they never returned, even in the briefest or mildest form, or during the concluding and recuperative phase, when all the other symptoms became active again after having been in abeyance for some time. In the same way, they never came up in the hypnotic analysis and were not traced back to emotional or imaginative sources. I am therefore inclined to think that their appearance was not due to the same psychical process as was that of the other symptoms, but is to be attributed to a secondary extension of that unknown condition which, you'll have to scroll, sir, unknown condition which constitutes the somatic foundation of hysterical phenomena.
So what he's talking about here is that some problems when you solve, they never come back. And other problems when you solve, they come back. There is a relapse. Right? So there are relapse related symptoms and symptoms which don't relapse. And the idea here is if you look at the tree of trauma, right, if you solve certain leaves, then on that branches, new leaves can come. But if you remove that branch itself, the entire thing goes. Right? Now, one practical example can be, let us say somebody has a particular obsession. He has the obsession of washing hands. And you go into therapy, and after some time, he gives up washing hands, but he starts the obsession of the looking at the locks, whether they are locked or not. So what has happened is one particular type of obsession has been healed. After some time, there is an interval and the second obsession starts. So you're substituting one obsession by another. So this is where the root has not been healed. And the Freud's idea will be that some part of the affect has been released, but some part is inside. Let us go to 44. We just have 2 pages to go, 44 and 45.
Two states of consciousness persisted side by side. The primary one, in which she was quite normal psychically, and a secondary one, which may well be likened to a dream in view of its wealth of imaginative products and hallucinations, its large gaps of memory, and a lack of inhibition and control in its associations. In this secondary state, the patient was in a condition of alienation. The fact that the patient's mental condition was entirely dependent on the intrusion of this secondary state into the normal one seems to throw considerable light on at least one class of hysterical psychosis. Every one of her hypnosis in the evening afforded evidence that the patient was entirely clear and well ordered in her mind and normal as regards her feeling and volition, so long as one of the products of her secondary state was acting as a stimulus in the unconscious. The extremely marked psychosis, which appeared whenever there was any considerable interval in this unburdening process, showed the degree to which those products influence the psychical events of her normal state. It is hard to avoid expressing the situation by saying that the patient was split into two personalities, of which one was mentally normal and the other insane. The sharp division between the two states in the present patient only exhibits more clearly, in my opinion, what has given rise to a number of unexplained problems in many other hysterical patients. It was especially noticeable in Anna O how much the products of her bad self, as she herself called it, affected her moral habit of mind. If this if these products had not been continually disposed of, we should have been faced by a hysteric of the malicious type, refractory, lazy, disagreeable, and ill natured. But as it was, after the removal of those stimuli, her true character, which was the opposite of all these, always reappeared at once.
Uh, this brings a very important point of the even the importance of maintenance. That if the therapy is going on for a long time, but somehow the fundamental cure is not happening, then one way out is to see whether our analysis is correct and if the right school of psychoanalysis or right way of therapy is applied. That is one way. Second important point is what is the option the person has. If fundamental cure cannot be done, and let us assume that no shortcoming of the therapist is involved, then the whole problem is that uh, maintenance is still better than deterioration. So if the choice is between cure and maintenance, of course we go for cure. But if the choice is between maintenance and deterioration, then we have no choice but for maintenance. And in some extreme cases, very extreme cases, you may be faced with this kind of choice. Okay, the cure just doesn't seem anywhere on the horizon. We cannot even look at 60% cure, but we are looking at just maintenance. And only in the long run, you can actually go towards the center. And this is something very fundamental. Uh, one of the most intense forms of therapy, one of the most intense, I would say, is ISTDP. Even in their uh, in their world of approach, ultimately they have come to realize that in very fragile patients, they will need between 50 to 150 sessions. Now, 150 sessions, if you look at one per week, which is the norm, we are still looking at 2 to 3 years, which is hardly a short-term therapy. Yeah. So they have also realized that although they, by definition, are intensive and short-term, when it comes to fragile patients, it just can't be done. So neither they remain short-term nor they remain intense. And unknowingly, without using the words, what Kohut used to say holding, they get into practice of holding. Right? So there seems to be something more fundamental than just the therapy technique or the skill of the therapist, which is at work, and it does take a minimum amount of time. Until that time, one is definitely largely a maintenance mode. It's like you can see it this way. Okay, you invest in some share and you get dividend and you get capital appreciation. So in our analogy, unless the capital appreciation reaches a particular point, the capacity is built up, we really can't go into strong interpretation or strong release of feelings. So it is like step one is to build up capacity. Step two is to build up willingness, do a lot of analysis intellectually, and then go for the heavy lifting of encountering and releasing feelings, which is the one of the most difficult parts of therapy. Yeah. Let us go to page 45. This is the last page of our case.
Nevertheless, though her two states were thus sharply separated, not only did the secondary state intrude into the first one, but, and this was at all events frequently true, and even when she was in a very bad condition, a clear sighted and calm observer sat, as she put it, in a corner of her brain and looked on at all the mad business. This persistence of clear thinking while the psychosis was actually going on found expression in a very curious way. At a time when, after the hysterical phenomena had ceased, the patient was passing through a temporary depression, she brought up a number of childish fears and self reproaches, and among them, the idea that she had not been ill at all and that the whole business had been stimulated. Similar observations, as we know, have frequently been made. When a disorder of this kind has cleared up and the two states of consciousness have once more become merged into one, the patients, looking back to the past, see themselves as the single undivided personality which was aware of all the nonsense. They think they could have prevented it if they had wanted to, and thus they feel as though they had done all the mischief deliberately. It should be added that this normal thinking, which persisted during the secondary state, must have fluctuated enormously in its amount and must very often have been completely absent.
Right. So this is very important. There is a normal state of the mind which is coping up with reality inside and outside, and there is this intruding state of pathology. And how far the intruding state of pathology captures the normal state determines the intensity of the difficulty. So in our language today, we will call absence or presence of insight the same thing. That what she calls the observer, we would call as insight. And this brings up two words which are very important, which are important today, not coined at that time: the observing ego and the participating ego. So the observing part of the ego observes all that goes on. Right? And the more it can observe with detachment, easier it is to cure what is going on. Now, this uh, observer, as Anna O calls it, or observing ego as psychoanalysis calls it today, actually is a age-old concept in Hindu spirituality. In our language, we will call it Sakshi Bhav. Right? That the Sakshi Bhav, which is the core of all meditation practices, right? That you keep observing yourself. You first observe the body, then you observe the emotions, then you observe the thoughts, then you keep observing all that happens inside of you, and you look at yourself as a pure observer. So that is an age-old concept. The more you strengthen the observer, less the events which are going on will be able to capture you. And the same thing is put in terms of another Sanskrit terms, the Purush and Prakriti. That the observer is the Purush, and all the events which are going on is seen as Prakriti. So this is something which comes reinvented over and over again. In last century's philosophical arena, you can look at Krishnamurti. He has the same idea, right? What he calls choiceless self-awareness. Now, choiceless self-awareness is the same as Sakshi Bhav, what you also develop in Vipassana or in any meditative practice. But we see the same thing repeated here in a different way, that there was a observer who had an insight on what is happening. Even if what was happening was pathological, there was one part of the mind which had an insight that pathological things are happening in the mind. That part may not be powerful enough to prevent it, but it is powerful enough to be separate from it and note it. So we have an observer who is weak but still free, not captured completely by the upsurge. And many people believe or report after the pathology is healed, it looks like a bad dream. It looks like a bad dream is over. And what he calls here the two consciousness coming in. a normal consciousness and a second consciousness which was pathological coming up in that hypnotic state, the two of them joining together, an integration. Right? And the integration leads to a cure, which is of course accompanied by catharsis of feelings. So let us go ahead.
I have already described the astonishing fact that from beginning to end of the illness, all the stimuli arising from the secondary state, together with their consequences, were permanently removed by being given verbal utterance in hypnosis, and I have only to add an assurance that this was not an invention of mine which I imposed on the patient by suggestion. It took me completely by surprise, and not until symptoms had been got rid of in this way, in a whole series of instances, did I develop a therapeutic technique out of it.
So it's a very important point. This paragraph tells us that there's something called a talking cure, and a particular kind of talking, if we do, it leads to healing. There can be a counter question: can the patient use this talking as a defense? And ISTDP goes on that line that free association can be used as a defense. Right? So they don't use free association so much. Right? They go into the visceral feeling of the emotion in the body. When we go deeper into it, I'll come to it, what they exactly mean by it. But the point I'm simply trying to put across is, for Freud, free association is a way to healing. That in some way, due to free association, the unconscious becomes conscious in a cognitive sense, and the unconscious repressed affect is catharted out. And therefore, healing happens. Freud never thought of free association can be used as a defense, but those in ISTDP do believe that some patients can actually use free association as a defense. The idea here is that free association is like water put into a sink. That wherever you put the water, ultimately it will go to the mouth of the sink. It will converge there. Right? So all free associations have this converging quality, that they will converge at the root of pathology in some way. Whereas those in ISTDP believe that free associations can be used to actually centrifugally move out from the core towards away from the core. And they can have this centrifugal quality to them instead of the centripetal quality to them. Let us go to the last paragraph.
The final cure of the hysteria deserves a few more words. It was accompanied, as I have already said, by considerable disturbances and a deterioration in the patient's mental condition. I had a very strong impression that the numerous products of her secondary state, which had been quiescent, were now forcing their way into the consciousness, and though in the first instance they were being remembered only in her secondary state, they were nevertheless burdening and disturbing her normal one. It remains to be seen whether it may not be that the same origin is to be traced in other cases in which a chronic hysteria terminates in a psychosis.
So we have read Freud in original of his first case, the case of NAO. So here we see it is just a precursor to the core concepts of Freud, the concepts which lead to the model of the mind, concepts which lead to ego and superego, concepts which lead to defenses, and concepts which lead to finer distinguishing of different pathologies. So this is like a matrix, a kind of a primal pristine matrix from which other concepts later on in the history of psychotherapy slowly emerged out, became more distilled, more refined, more finely carved out. So if there are any questions we can take up, or we can stop for the day. Yes, please.
There's one quick question. I can imagine and visualize that patients can manipulate the method of psychoanalysis and they speak the language but hide behind the terminology.
Correct.
But it seems very difficult or almost impossible that one could use free association to dissuade or to distract the therapist in some other direction and actually avoid the analysis.
Uh, yes. Uh, the free association, if it's really free, it will have a converging quality. It will in some way reflect something in the unconscious. The problem arises when what we call free association is actually a conscious activity. The free association is actually a conscious activity. Now, when free association becomes a conscious activity, it's not actually free association. Free association presupposes spontaneity.
Agreed. But conscious control was the aim for Freud.
So the uh, idea of Freud was where id is, there ego shall be.
Yeah, it's great.
His statement was where id is, there ego shall be. Meaning what was before unconscious now comes under conscious control. Right? Now, how will that happen? That will not happen if you have conscious control on your expression in therapy. So the idea that you can start with conscious control of your expression and take that conscious control to the unconscious, and there, by that control, cure the id of the problem and bring it under the ego's control, that is not doable. So the way to that is that initially you take the ego back, right? And you allow the free association to happen. Because when you take the ego back in the background, the id can leak itself out. It is like, let us say you go to see a movie. Now, if the ego is in the front and active, right, you will say to yourself that all these people are doing what they are doing because they are paid for it. Right? Left to themselves in real life, not one of them is going to do what they are doing on the screen. Now, if you keep that rationality high, you cannot enjoy the movie. So, in order to be immersed into the movie or in any art form, you have to deactivate the ego, right? And allow the id to get into identification process. Only by identification you are immersed in that experience. Right? So similarly, in psychoanalysis, when somebody is coming in for therapy, the frame is so created that you put the ego back, you deactivate the ego to some extent by use of the couch, by use of the safety or so on, and allow the unconscious to leak out. So first step is you let go of control. You let go of control, and as you let go of control, the unconscious leaks out. And as the unconscious leaks out, slowly you analyze it, and then you know the core problem. Then whatever is at the core becomes conscious and the feelings are released. And when that happens, then automatic control of the ego happens there. So it is like giving up control of the ego to establish control of the ego. But we cannot go, you start with exercising control in the conscious and then take it to the unconscious. That method does not work in this framework of psychoanalysis.
Surrender first.
And that may be more of a CBT kind of approach. Establish control in
Yeah.
one area or slowly take it down. Fine. So, should we stop for the day?
Thank you, sir.
Fine. Next time we will continue with the model of the mind and defenses, and thereafter psychosexual stages, and then we can go to taking cases. I think once we take cases, it will be more interesting for everyone.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
sir.